Dear all, very warm welcome to our today's TNI panel on Beyond China threat, Beyond China threat, China's investments in Eastern Europe and the reorganization of global capitalism. And I'm aware that there has been very high interest in the panel, and I'm very glad that many of us are joining our discussion today, which I think is well justified because the topic is really big, but we have done so far either a fairly small amount of research or the kind of research that we will be today criticizing. But before going into the description of the panel, and before presenting the panelists, let me ask the organizer of the panel, Agnes Gagi, to present the background under which this panel was offered and organized today.
Yeah, thank you, Lela. So my name is Agnes Gagyi, and together with Andrei Strachalek, we are the editors of this book. I just posted its link into the chat. It is a collection of analysis by a new generation of left thinkers from Eastern Europe that we work together in collaboration with TNI, the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. And the book title is The Political Economy of Eastern Europe 30 Years into the Transition, New Left Perspectives from the Region. Now, of course, New left thought in the region and about the region goes much beyond the analysis that are collected in this book. So with the occasion of its publication, together with TNI, we thought that instead of just organizing releases for the book, we would organize a 4-piece webinar series that rather tries to take the discussion further and present left perspectives from the region on several key issues that are not necessarily the forte of the book. And Chinese investments in Eastern Europe are one of them for all the obvious reasons. So I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you all for joining us. And also, we would like to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the European Cultural Foundation for supporting the work on this project at its different phases.
Thank you so much, Agi. Then let me first present the panelists and myself, and then a little bit the topic of our today's discussion. I'm myself, Lela Rekhviashvili. I'm based at Leibniz-Institut for Regional Geography, which is a small but very nice institute in Leipzig focusing on Eastern Europe. I'm a trained political economist who has been very much focusing on mobility infrastructures in post-Soviet cities, but lately I've been also looking at regional or peripheral regions in large infrastructural developments. As for our amazing speakers, Aleksandar Matković is a philosopher and a political activist from Serbia, working at the Institute of Economic Sciences in Belgrade. He's working on Marxism and Chinese investments in Serbia and runs a blog called Research and Alternatives. And I would also immediately ask Aleksandar to share perhaps the link to his blog, and also say immediately that we will try to share some of the resources, which is about our own work, but also beyond on the topic in the chat, and also welcome all of you participants to share further links and resources with us. Then next is Linda Szabó, who has studied Chinese migration and its interplay with urban transformation at the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Central European University. She is a co-founder of Peripheria Policy and Research Center. And in the past years, she has broadened her research focus from migration to focus on social spatial transformations and Chinese investments on various scales, with particular interest in infrastructure developments and primarily the case of Budapest-Belgrade railway construction, which many of you have heard is very often portrayed as this big flagship infrastructure project of China in Eastern Europe. And finally, Tamás is a political economist who is currently doing his PhD at the State University of New York, Binghamton. His research field of interest is semi-peripheral development, dependent development, also looking at infrastructural projects and state formation in Eastern Europe, but also in Eastern Africa. Tamás is an external research fellow at the Institute of World Economics, Center of Economic and Regional Studies, and a member of the Budapest-based Working Group for Public Sociology, HAST. We have come, all of us have come here together in a way, how do I say, basically our coming together is growing out of certain concerns that we've accumulated regarding the existing research on China, Chinese presence in Eastern Europe. And just to set the stage, right, this before we talk of Eastern Europe particularly, in general, Chinese outwards investments have been something that is very widely discussed in past years, especially actually in past 2 weeks, because just about 2 weeks ago, AIDS Data published new research, which basically overviews the volume of Chinese outward investments in past 20 years and concludes or illustrates that in these 2 decades, China has essentially given about 850 billion US dollars in loans, which obviously is quite gigantic in its scale and also gigantic in comparison to what other donor countries and regions have done in the past decades. And a lot of concerns are going towards articulating how much of these Chinese loans are shadowy loans, the ones that are hardly accounted for. Now, in general, and this is to emphasize that in general, Chinese outwards investments are really problematized as this kind of very risky investments. And perhaps there is a good reason to it. But when it comes to Eastern Europe, I would say that there is a particular panic about Chinese investments, even if we look at it, Chinese investments in Eastern Europe are far smaller compared to Chinese investments in other world regions, including European core Northwestern countries, but also other world regions like Southeast Asia or Africa or Latin America or Central Asia. And yet, when it comes to Europe's internal peripheries, that is Central EU member Eastern and Central Europe, as well as immediate external peripheries, which is Southeastern Europe and Caucasus and non-EU member Eastern European states. Concerns are really high, and these concerns run not only in media or Western liberal media, but also predominantly in academic narratives and academic studies on the region. And these concerns basically construct a range of political threats and economic threats that is directed towards Eastern Europe in particular, but also in general to Europe or European Union as a political unit. And such narratives, such dominating discourses would basically always portray the Chinese presence in Eastern Europe or Eastern Europe as China's Trojan horse, or as a step for China to get to Europe further, as a fertile ground for authoritarian advancement of China, and beyond such narratives would emphasize that China is using divide and rule tactics to basically endanger new East-West divides. In this panel, we will basically talk a lot on why such narrative is problematic, but I wanted to share, to set the stage, some of my own observations, why I find this very, how do I say, singular narrative about Chinese presence in Eastern Europe quite troubling so far. And the core reason is that such narrative is basically coming out of a lot of erasures. On the one hand, not on the one hand, but primarily it engages with China and also Eastern European states on the level of state relationships. So you end up looking at China as this kind of new, unique beast that enters Eastern Europe, and you also end up looking at Eastern European states as reduced to their political elites, which obviously then loses the sight on the class differences and loses the sight over the fact that even if some of the Chinese investments might be quite beneficial for certain political elites, it might not be so beneficial for certain locations or certain communities or certain societies. Another reason is that when we talk of this Chinese investments as you know, China pushed thing and unique thing, we lose the sight of interconnectedness of the flows of capital. And the last thing is that we lose the sight of what has been happening in Eastern Europe before the arrival of China, and we portray through this narrative basically Eastern Europe as this kind of blank page greenfield for China, which obviously it is not. So to build on these initial comments, I very warmly invite the speakers to essentially try, I mean, to summarize the purpose of us getting together here is that we try to dig into existing efforts to overcome the dominant hegemonic narration of Chinese presence in Eastern Europe and see how few of leftist scholars have been trying to engage with the research on Chinese investments beyond this kind of China threat narratives. So I will be then inviting the speakers to first of all, give the background of and about Eastern Europe and Chinese presence in Eastern Europe, and start filling up the blank page as it is portrayed so far. First, I will ask Linda, because her research has been really preceding the wave of what I call panic of the China threat.
Yes, thanks for introducing me, Lela, and also for the kind invitation, Aggie. And hello, everyone. Yeah, right. So as Lela said, I was studying Chinese migration first, which appeared in Eastern Europe in the early 1990s, and then, of course, everything changed even in the academic discourse as well, but also, of course, on the political discourse and public debates as well, how China is portrayed. And the way Lela described this, it's a very bipolar representation of China, like as being a threat, either a threat or there are also some voices claiming that China being the possibility to make some dreams coming true in peripheral areas of the globe. And so going beyond that narrative, I think it's important to see what's going on or what has been going on in China in the last couple of decades, and how China's political and economic influence rose so much in the last couple of days and decades, and why such hegemonic actors of the globe like the US is frightened of China's rise. And so I thought that it's important to see also how Eastern Europe has become a part of interest of the Chinese state, and it's important to emphasize that, as Lela said, that the Chinese state is not the same as the Chinese private corporations or Chinese people themselves. So when we talk about the growth of Chinese influence, we tend to think about the Chinese state. And then, so why the Chinese state became interested in this part of the world that is Eastern Europe is, I mean, finding out the causes is very much relates to the shifting geopolitical context, like as it changed also earlier, like it's, I know the Hungarian case the most, so I can just give you an example how the Chinese state thought or decided to approve reform of the state socialism in the 1950s in Hungary. So how Zhou Enlai and the Chinese state intervened in Hungarian politics in 1956, related really much to its relations and political and economic relations to the Soviet Union, and also in what it happened in the early 2000s, how Eastern Europe came onto the radar, and why Eastern Europe became also part of the interest of the Chinese state relates very much to Eastern European countries' accession to the European Union, and also the candidacy of many countries in the Balkan states. So I'm sure we are going to talk a lot more about the geopolitical context of the current happenings, but going back a bit in time and see how China as opening up and reform, which was initiated in the late 1970s, reintegrated the economy, the Chinese economy, in global capitalism. And even though there was a kind of shift of state-led economy to more towards those kind of structural adjustments, which happened in many countries in the 1980s, and were led by the and were initiated by the US-led institutions, was much more careful in the case of China. And so those structural reforms which were carried out in the 1980s in China, which was to become and follow export-led, a labor-intensive export-led development model that made it basically possible for China to become a production of all global manufacturing, the major production side, and the capital surplus, which it could gain through the trade agreements with the US in the 1990s, made it a rather partner for the US government without basically any fear of becoming a hegemonic competitor later on. So, but what happened in the early 2000s and how the state policy changed in the late 1990s, that the government decided to turn from an export-led development to a more capital intensive investment-led development growth model. And so with the initiation of the going out or go global policy, mainly private enterprises were encouraged to invest in foreign countries as well. And this led in the early 2000s to the rise of the so-called South-South type of cooperations. And that when happened, that many Chinese companies invested in the global peripheries, that is in Latin America, Africa, and also Middle Eastern countries. And already back then we could see a few examples of investments in Eastern Europe as well. Also related to what I said, the EU accession plans. And how these South-South type of cooperations could be consolidated, really much thanks to the 2008 financial crisis, where we could experience or we could witness a retreat of US and Western European investors from these peripheral areas. And so China's influence could rise across the globe, basically, and also and what happened with the 2013 launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. The state-owned enterprises could gain a momentum in this sense. So if we compare the actors, the investors from before 2010, we see that more private companies dominated the investments, the foreign investments, the field of foreign investments, while after the BRI, state-owned enterprises are becoming more, gaining more significant roles, especially in the infrastructure, the building of the infrastructure networks that affects Eastern Europe the most. So I think what was the main aim of the government here is to go up on the ladder of the global value chains, and so turning from a labor-intensive to a capital-intensive production, it tried to become more like, as I said, following an investment-led model with this. And maybe I stop here and let the others talk as well, and follow up on different details related to this process.
Thanks, Linda, so much. Yes, I would ask Tamás, you now shared the side of China, while maybe Tamás can now come in and tell us the East European side of what has been happening in the last 2 decades that brought to the today's situation.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for the kind invitation, and enjoy participating in this discussion. So, well, maybe before we really turn on to Eastern Europe, I might also just want to reiterate a little bit of what Linda started explaining, more in a historical perspective and also on a global level, because, well, in my research, I learned that it's very important to emphasize this global context. So none of these actors we look at, whether they are state actors or private entities or social groups, are outside of these historical capitalism, let me put it in this way, but we are all interrelated and independent in one way or another. And what may be the task for us as researchers, as well as, you know, political intellects or discussants, to kind of understand what are these interdependencies and linkages, and what are the kind of forces, large forces that we see emerging locally as well, but they're not just in the local context. So this is maybe like a bit of a methodological disclaimer of how I think it's worth to engage in the discussion. And yeah, maybe some of the things Linda mentioned, I would just pick them up a little bit to maybe to elaborate on them, or how I see them. Is, of course, there's this big debate about, you know, rising new hegemons or hegemonic shifts or hegemonic contestation. So this is a big question of the kind of a historical moments or historical conjunctures in which we live, to sort of give a like an analytical framework for that, what's been exactly happening since the 1970s. Linda mentioned that was a kind of a starting point for China to reintegrate into geopolitics. If you can recall it, that was the kind of big change between the Republic of China, the People's Republic of China, due to US foreign policy interventions into the kind of like a Cold War approach. Not surprisingly, after the so-called Soviet-Sino split. So that was a very new era in the geopolitical landscape that opened up space for the People's Republic of China still at the time of Mao, as well as the economic aspects, as Linda mentioned, that China started a lot of economic initiatives, even starting with Mao, but it's probably more like Deng Xiaoping's name is associated with this reform period from the 70s and 80s onwards, which was the kind of maybe we might say like a start of a long process, which led to this more, like the view of a hegemonic power. China is becoming more like a hegemonic power clearly in a capitalist world system, and I think, of course, it has its own historical and social and institutional peculiarities, but it's within the global capitalist system, which is important to understand those reforms. They are, as Linda mentioned, you can compare them to a lot of other countries at the time. What happened in the global South and East, how these reforms were initiated, whether by force from external actors, donors, institutions, or whether from internal reform technocrats, if you like, or from internal like social groups, organized politically, or how the two interacted in most cases. And that would, of course, put China into a very peculiar concrete context, how it occurred in China was of course different from how, for example, it occurred in Hungary, which would be an interesting parallel or comparison. Because maybe the other thing, if you want to talk about Eastern Europe, that a lot of these things that's happened since the 1970s affected Eastern Europe as well, and some of these countries started their own way of reintegration into the capitalist world economy under very much the same forces. However, they had different types of effects or these kind of interlinkages between the domestic political forces and these international forces differed greatly from the China experience, but these were not different forces. So we see this story in Eastern Europe going into a similar direction. This is all part of this large global restructuring in the world economy that really exacerbated from the 1970s onwards, from the crisis period of the 1970s, on all these levels, economic levels and political levels, still in the kind of a Cold War context. Interesting footnote to add that due to some of our own historical peculiarities, for example, in Hungary, a lot of the reform agendas at the time initiated by some kind of liberal economists, still under the auspices of state socialism, their work was very much, raised some attentions in China, and even in today's scholarly world, it still operates as a reference for those Chinese scholars who very much work on, China's integration, like what it means China becoming this global powerhouse, and how you can relate it to even these early reform thinkers of the 70s and 80s. For example, Kornai is a Hungarian economist who's probably more popular in China than in Hungary today, although he's quite popular in Hungary as well. So these were not just parallels; they filtered into politics and at least academic intellectual debates quite early on, I would say. So where does this go? Like, this is a question I like to formulate this question, not necessarily like, is China hegemon, or will it be hegemon, or was it hegemon? That's too conclusive even in the form of a question. But what's happening in the world economy, where all these restructuring lead, how it affects China and China's relationship with the rest of the world, whether we want to look at in this so-called South-South relationship. Of course, it's super important and interesting, again, from the 70s, 80s onwards, when you see these popular movements in the freshly independent, post-colonial states, for example, in Africa, who try to navigate in this Cold War, framework. And, this, for example, this China split opened up a new space for them to orient in their own, economic agendas of nationalism or some kind of internationalism as well. So China played a very, very significant role. And again, no coincidence that a lot of or some of these very early overseas Chinese investments at the time, even under Mao, went to Africa at the time. So it was a very interesting way how China started, this diplomatic effort with economic and cultural and all other means in Africa. And again, it's where did it lead, right? What's happening now in Africa in terms of Chinese investments is, yeah, it's an interesting question. I understand it's probably the subject of another panel, but again, part of this large restructuring that I'm talking about, and yeah, I think we tend to agree with Linda on a lot of these terminologies, of analytical terminologies, that there is this historical conjuncture of a hegemonic shift, and a lot of the kind of contestations of a new period of even imperial conquest. Let me refer back to Africa a little bit, the new scramble for Africa phenomena, which is very much focusing on China in particular. And what I also use as a framework here is that kind of like a multipolarization of the system, both geopolitically and in economic senses as well. So that's where China actually feeding into and driving a lot of these forces. But maybe the second point I would want to emphasize here, Linda mentioned, again, I'll just elaborate a little bit, that it's not only sort of, how to put it nicely, it's not only about the free will of these actors. We shouldn't necessarily look at it as what China wants, or Chinese government decided to invest in Africa because they wanted to invest in Africa or whatever, or Eastern Europe. But there are a lot of these forces are constraining China as well. And there are a lot of push factors in China, internal political domestic push factors, but serious economic, constraints coming from the world economy. And that applies to other hegemonic imperial shifts as well. But sometimes this is really, you really understand these decisions in the kind of relationality with these forces, and not independently from that. So one thing I just wanted to highlight or pinpoint a little bit, that we see China's rising investment activity, although it has its ups and downs and a little bit of a bumpy road throughout in the last decade at least, but it really kickstarted or jumped off, if you like, from 2010-ish, early 2010. So a good decade ago. It has its long history from before, but we really see it's coming up. And that's, again, no coincidence or should be no surprise to anyone, because that's exactly the crisis period in the world economy, the 2008 and 2009 crisis. And a lot of the things China has been doing ever since then goes back to, for example, the Chinese way of tackling the crisis internally, with very peculiar investment policies, regional policies, political adaptations, political controlling, as well as liberalizing segments of the economy. And I assume that the driving forces, or some of the driving forces behind China's overseas investments or capital export, goes back to how China managed, how China's attempt to manage the crisis internally, but it couldn't actually doing it without going, internationalizing it. One example that I've worked a little bit on was even the Chinese currencies is an interesting thing. It's still a relatively minor share in international transactions, but it's growing. It's visibly growing. It's become part of the IMF currency basket, the SDR, and especially in some bilateral transactions in Asia, in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, it's really coming up, and that happened exactly at the time of the crisis, when there was a lack of dollar liquidity, and China had to trade with their partners. It didn't want its closest partners to go bankrupt, so it started lending them, but it didn't just want to give out all the dollars it had, so they agreed to lend in Chinese currencies. And this was under an enormous pressure that how they wanted to manage this crisis, but it triggered China's currency's internationalization's journey, which is an ongoing process, but it really stemmed out from this crisis management practice. And yeah, I know I stayed a little too long with the global aspects here, but one interesting thing about China's activity, especially state-led infrastructural projects in our region, Eastern Europe, is that the Chinese currency plays a role in that too, and the central banks of some of these countries, again, I know Hungary a little bit better, and maybe Poland, are very interested in, you know, tapping or getting a bit of an access to China's reserves, and not necessarily in dollar terms, but in China's currency terms as well. So we see a lot of the activities in recent years initiated between the central banks, actually, interestingly, and by the financial system itself. So banks setting up their offshore branches, you know, allowing accounts in Eastern Europe, also in this currency. And yeah, so this is a big story. I just picked a few aspects. Maybe I'll also stop shortly, just with a bit of a concluding remarks on this last point. That we discussed a little bit of China's perspective here, and in terms of, you know, these global forces, but of course, why Eastern Europe, or where Eastern Europe comes into the picture. And, you know, in a way, it's a minor player on the China radar, as you all have mentioned, and as I may show some statistics, even in the sort of external funding schemes of these countries, China is a growing player, but it's not a super giant source of funding if you compare it to the quote unquote traditional sources, which is, for example, German FDI in various manufacturing industries in most of the countries in our concerns. So what are the perspectives for these countries? Why are they interested in China or in Chinese funding? It has its own history of yes, dependencies and dependent development, and how these countries are, you know, lacking capital, to put it this way, and they are very much dependent on capital imports, and that hugely affects their internal economies and political life as well, state formations, if you want to use very heuristic terms here. And yes, elites in Eastern Europe tend to navigate in these very dire interdependent situations, and one way, and that was not such a big novelty, but the one way they discovered how to navigate it is to, you know, diversify away and use every niches and spaces that has been opened up for them, in particular, to get funding and to loosen their traditional historical dependencies, mostly from the West. So again, this is part of this shift and multipolarization process, how they want to play Chinese money off with, let's say, other sources of money. And we'll have interesting examples. I might come back to this at a later point, how, for example, the Hungarian government is actually refusing certain types of EU loans, like these special, you know, these pandemic rescue fund loans. Instead, it's increasing a lot of loans from Chinese projects because of, I assume, geopolitical concerns here and this diversification attempt. Yeah, so we'll get back to this probably, and I'll leave it more like open as a question of, okay, what's happening in most of these countries in Eastern Europe with regards to the world systemic shifts that, you know, is putting a force on them also to look out for alternative sources of funding in particular.
Thank you so much, Tamás. You talked long, and I still want to ask you more questions immediately. And I would be really happy, actually, if after this first round of our discussion, if we have time to come back to these questions and also kind of dig deeper into how similar, how different this Chinese response to post-crisis situation is from the history of capital, from what we've seen from other imperial powers in the history of capitalism, and whether this, you know, tendency of geographic expansion of capital is something very new, right? But before then, I will come back to Aleksandar and ask him to also reflect on this initial question. But perhaps, Aleksandar, I will also ask you, because for the next round of our comments, we are planning to share really bits from the actual case study researches from all three panelists. So in this case, Aleksandar, I would ask you to, if you like, reflect on the first question, first round of the question that we had, but also immediately start introducing your own case study research as well.
Okay. So thanks everyone, thanks for coming, and thanks to Agi for having me invited and organized everything, and thanks to all the organizers also. So I actually agree with Tamás. Tamás laid out a lot of things. I will try to pick up some pieces and reflect back to my perspective on the work I did. So first of all, I absolutely agree. So if you want to understand China, you've got to go back to 2008. So that's like the number one rule, I would say, basically. And not only that, I mean, if I could make like a bold claim, so to speak, I mean, if you want to understand the whole world, you have to go back, of course, to how different continents and different political powers actually answered the crisis of 2008, because it was not answered universally. There was like at least three different dominant answers to the crisis of 2008. The European one, as you all probably know and experienced yourselves, is probably the worst, I'd say. Austerity measures, cutting back social welfare, healthcare, etc. Then you have the American response, which was, I mean, I'm simplifying because there's really not too much time, too little time and too much information. But the American response was, of course, to bail out the banks, and as we all probably know, and also to institute what's known as credit swap lines. So Tamás mentioned only some of those. So basically, that was the first time that the American Fed acted beyond the borders of America, and basically they made swap agreements, meaning that they exchanged different currencies so as to save also European banks should they fail. And one swap line will also extend back to Beijing, from Beijing to other Asian nations. So that's how basically the American response went. But China had a totally different response. So if you go back to how the European Union's idiotic, if I could say, response to the crisis of using complete austerity, you all remember the battle with Greece, etc. Basically, that's where the European left kind of sprang out of. Also, basically, one of the consequences of this sort of cutting back of whatever you can was actually something that's not well known, and that's the global fall in commodity prices afterwards in 2015 and 16. So about 37%, because I mean, I'm also speculating a bit here. There's too much factors, but a lot of that went away from Europe, the fall in Europe for like commodity products. I mean, including steel, including copper, etc. So commodity prices began to fluctuate. At the same time, in response to the 2008 crisis, and as well to this, China actually instituted what's known as the largest fiscal stimuluses in the history of the entire world, basically. So China began to invest a lot in infrastructure. So one of the main and one of the largest responses to the crisis of 2008 was not the US's response. The US had its own fiscal stimulus in part, but the largest fiscal stimulus came actually from China. I mean, just to give you some example of what this means. So China implemented the largest healthcare program in history. It rose healthcare insurance coverage from 30% to 19% of its population. I mean, it's the size of China. You have several billion people. I mean, at stake. It's not a small number. And actually, they agreed to land about $586 billion on a spending program, which actually was used to fund massive government infrastructural projects in the wake of also what's another Chinese characteristic. They had earthquakes in 2008, apart from the economic crisis. So that's how you get all these huge infrastructural projects going into housing, education. And I mean, just to also give you one sort of, proof of how this gets translated into a huge ecological problem as well. China from 2015 to 2017 actually produced and used as 2 times as much cement than the US in the whole 20th century. So this is actually a statistic from Václav Smil. He's also known as the favorite economist of Bill Gates. So huge amount of cement and huge amounts of infrastructural projects go into the Chinese answer to the 2008 crisis. What this means when you take out the crisis actually translated to the fall of demand, this means that basically once you build huge cement factories, once you build huge houses, etc., you also got bubbles which are kind of bursting up now with the Evergrande, and you also get a crisis of overcapacity. So where are you going to export your products? Where are you going to export mobile phones, shoes, etc.? And also, again, just to give you, just to paint a small picture of the sheer quantity of what's being sold and produced. I mean, China alone produces 80% of the world's air conditioners. It produces 70% of the world's mobile phones and 60% of the world's shoes. I mean, where are you going to export this if there is a crisis in Europe? If you are building your infrastructure, building more factories, producing more and more, so this gets translated into a crisis of overcapacity and underconsumption. So that's how basically 2008 played out between Europe, US, and China. I'm of course completely simplifying, but if you should push me to say what happened after 2008, I would say that this happened. There was a crisis of overcapacity because of the differences in the responses to the crisis of 2008 between China, Europe, and the US. But I would actually go further back in time, and this kind of connects us with our case today. To the 1970s, and it's kind of good to compare Yugoslavia to China, because I mean you might find this a bit shocking, but actually China had a deficit, a trade deficit in relation to Yugoslavia. I mean that's one of the most striking data I have. From 69 to 72, China was actually exporting less to Yugoslavia than Yugoslavia was exporting to China. I mean, this tells you how bad the economy was during Mao Zedong's time. So, and this is also during Mao Zedong was actually alive at a time. So, Yugoslavia actually had a trade surplus with China. It's kind of like you cannot imagine today. Imagine Hungary exporting more products to China than China buying. It's not imaginable. I mean, you don't have so many producers, and I mean, the markets are completely different. So that can never happen again, basically. But it happened from 69 to 72. And I mean, during Mao Zedong's time also, and after, especially after Mao Zedong, another important thing happened. So you have companies like IBM, for example, Boeing, Ford, and General Motors are all beginning to outsource their production into China. Of course, I mean, after the Second World War, and after, I mean, I don't want to go too much into history, but after the heated economies kind of cooled down, profitability began to fall, and today you have I mean, mentioned some, but you have Apple, Nike, Walmart, IBM, Hewlett Packard, Boeing, Kingston, I mean, Ford, blah, blah. So a lot of companies, American companies, outsourcing production to China, of course. This is the basics. And essentially, what happens afterwards, what happens today, you get the same American companies who previously outsourced their production. And basically, you have, Trump and the trade war between China and America. You had like wages rising in China. So now, what's happening is a restructuring of the global value chains. So we mentioned some of that in the beginning. It's the idea that you could wage a wage war against China while American companies are also located in China is kind of like nonsense, of course. And this is somehow like what value chains are being restructured, about those value chains which were also outsourced in the 1970s. That's why the 1970s is also another important and actually crucial point if you want to talk about China. So coming back to Serbia and coming back to our present moment, basically, the case from Yugoslavia looks something like this. Of course, it follows the global the global trends. Of course, Yugoslavia collapsed in the 90s along with the Eastern Bloc, but in a specific way. And we're still kind of not over that, basically, in terms of economy. What happened was we had Milosevic, of course, as you may know, and we had the wars. Milosevic was, of course, he had some pro-Chinese moments and kind of was at one point considering using the China's model, and essentially also opened the doors of Yugoslavia to Chinese immigrants, which then settled and made a lot of like China stores, etc. So that's kind of where the how to speak, the diplomatic ties kind of went a little bit warmer. Another moment is after the fall of Milosevic, during the President Boris Tadic. You don't need to remember the name, but essentially that's where Serbia started to get closer and closer ties with China. So coming back to what I just said from the value chains, at the same time, China, from the 12 five-year plan and basically up until today, has considered moving up the global value chains, meaning it will invest in more technology, more value-added products, and becoming less of an outsourced economy itself. So this is a huge transformation that's happening now. That's affecting also the American firms, hence the trade war. Also, it's also affecting where China will invest. And if you remember, as I said, that China began, to construct a lot of infrastructural projects. So this goes out also to invest in exporting investment abroad. One of the countries China does this is Serbia and the Balkans. And of course, if you remember what I talked about using cement, etc., that's why China has a lot of construction firms and companies who are investing a lot in the energy sector of the Balkan companies. And I will be actually sharing my screen maybe at this point, just to give you a good overview of what's kind of happening. So I mentioned Milosevic. I mentioned the 2000, after the fall of Milosevic, the period from the 2000s onward. So kind of like the warming up with Chinese-Serbian relations, which is happening at the same time that China wants to go up the value chains, is also reflected in the, here it is. So in the rise in China's investments in Serbia. So they go a little bit later on, but as you can see, they're gradually increasing. And so, the graph is a little bit different. If it was not for this gray line, which actually represents a single company called Linglong, it's a tire producers, which is causing a huge amount of discussion in Serbia. I will get to that.
Aleksandar?
Yes. Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry for interruption. I would love that you could, if you could make the full screen version of this.
Oh, sorry. Okay, here it is. I hope you can see it now. So basically, this is Chinese investments in Serbia. Yeah, the gray line is Linglong, the tire factory. Anyway, you can see a huge increase. I will be returning to this. I won't bore you with this anymore, but there's an increase. So you can see the map of like the major Chinese energy companies. Some of them are like located in Bor, copper, huge, basically the largest copper mine in the Balkans. The Linglong tire factory is in Zrenjanin, Meta, automobile producers. So construction companies are the major ones who are investing in the energy sector, and then you have tire producers, automobile producers, and parts, etc. And then it's like it's happening all over the Balkans as well. Then it's like interesting to see that also the number of Chinese workers gets exported here. I mean, just to recall, this is all part of going up the value chain. Since China is going up the value chain in China, it begins to export both investments and workers outside of its own country. And I mean, just to give you also another statistic, there's something called the Chinese Technical Cooperation Agencies, which actually export up to 1 million workers per year from China abroad. So this is all part of a consequence of a huge dynamic, a huge shift that's taking place from the value chains which were present in China, which are now being transformed, and the Chinese policy of going up the value chains, which is then translated into the Belt and Road countries, including Hungary, Serbia, and the rest of the Balkans. And I mean, the consequence of all of this is that you have more Chinese workers, more Chinese companies, more construction projects, like more discussion about that. And I think we will be touching upon this, more xenophobia, more political shifts. I mean, this is hugely impacting the entire region. I mean, I just want to underline how big this is. It's like not that there's just a single company or like Fudan University or something like that, just like popping out of nowhere. You have a huge process that goes back basically to 2008, then to the 70s, and which is currently taking place. So I would say that given a 50-year perspective, like a 60-year perspective, this is something of a novelty. And I mean, we don't have any blueprint for this. So we don't know how to, how to react what to do. So this is why there's so much of an insecurity regarding the role and the rise and the threat of China. And I would say that, I mean, once you know all this background information, and once you know that, you have to go back to 2008 and to the 17th, it's not something new, then, this China threat narrative, it just, becomes less stable. I mean, China has been rising at least for 20 years. So, and it's not something new. And it has been gradually transforming from the way the United States was treating it as a low-wage country, basically. Now those times are changing and those times are gone. And, we need to look at what's happening now. And what's happening now is precisely what you see on the graph. More Chinese investments abroad, more Chinese workers abroad. And, this changed the political shift in the political dynamics of our region. So, I mean, this is all connected to the internal dynamics of China and to the internal, relations between how the China and US handled the crisis of 2008 differently. Without that, you cannot understand what's going on here. I mean, I hope I didn't complicate stuff too much because it's already obviously complicated. There's a lot of info. I talk very fast, so I mean, I'm apologizing for that. Ask me if there's something, to be clarified, and I will go back to these graphs. So then I will, stop sharing now, and I mean, I hope that we move on. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aleksandar. In fact, indeed, there are some clarification questions waiting for you, but I would first ask Linda and Tamás to also present their case studies and then come back to Q&A session, if that's fine.
Okay, then I said maybe because my case, which actually I studied with a colleague of mine from Peripheria, Szabó, who is not present here, but we are preparing an article about the Budapest-Belgrade railway construction, which is usually presented as a flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative. And maybe I share also my screen with you because I'm not sure to what extent you are familiar with this initiative, which I already mentioned. But so this is a state policy which was introduced in 2013, and as I said, then the state-owned enterprises could gain a momentum to use their overcapacities, which also Aleksandar mentioned in the field of infrastructures, because this is mainly an infrastructure project, however, not only. So it's also kind of cultural project or investments into education and culture, especially in the Middle Eastern countries. But what in Eastern Europe we can see and hear about this project and how it's concerned is mainly through the rail freight transport, which is to be developed starting from China, both on the ground and also on the sea. Sorry for the poor quality of this picture, but probably you can see the map, how long and how different the initiatives are in terms of railroads, oil and gas pipelines. So it also affects the energy sector, Aleksandar was mentioning, and where this Budapest-Belgrade railway line is embedded and is the section starting from Port Piraeus in Greece, going to Germany and to Duisburg through Sofia, Belgrade, and Budapest. So minor part of which we also looked at, and maybe I hear how the timeline goes. Here, what I just wanted to emphasize that the multiscalar character of its institutional background of this project, because it's not only this is a project not only based on a bilateral, trilateral agreements signed between Serbia, Hungary, and People's Republic of China, but also it feeds into the EU-China cooperations and the connectivity platform, which was launched during the same time, and that kind of regional platform, which we called first 16+1 initiative. Now it's 17+1, since Greece also joined. And it fits into also the national politics and the current government's Eastern opening policy. However, it's as we already talked about, this was found in the local political and institutional constellations, a kind of opportunity to also to what Tamás mentioned, to build and develop a portfolio of investors, and instead of depending only on Western actors, try to initiate projects with China as well, and as alternative source of capital. And in the Hungarian case, what we found that this kind of construction is not really embedded into a national development plan in terms of developing local transportation, as opposed to Serbia, where after the 1990s, the war, the deficiencies of the railway transportation is highly important for any kind of economic development plans, and so it's more the development of the line between Belgrade and Calabria is more important in economic terms as well. While in case of Hungary, it was more a kind of a political project. I'm not saying that in Serbia it's not. Obviously, it is as well. Just I'm saying that in case of Hungary, where there were alternative sources of capital coming from the EU, which were not used, as also Tamás emphasized or pointed out, it is also a means for the local political elite to basically punch above its weight in a way, and try to get some economic sources for their own companies. And it's also obvious from the way they manages the projects. It's the construction itself on the Hungarian side hasn't started yet. On the Serbian side, it did. And what is interesting, and I wanted to point out that although it's considered a flagship project of the BRI in Europe, and the flagship project of the local governments, and the flagship project of the 17+1 regional cooperation, it is not only financed and carried out by not only by Chinese loans, but also Russian loans. So from here you can see nicely how mixed the sources of capital can be, and this is just an illustration, and I'm sure there are several other examples. You know how Chinese investors join Russian or Saudi Arabian investors as well, especially in those countries which have only limited access to EU funds in Eastern Europe. So here you can see for the Stara Pazova Novi Sad part section of the line, it's carried out from Russian loans. Basically the setup is very similar. So it's a loan. 55% of the construction is backed by loan, and the state-owned bank, which is giving the loan to the Serbian government, or to the Serbian state. And also the Chinese loans are state-backed loans given for the construction of the Belgrade, Stara Pazova, and Novi Sad Calabria sections. These constructions, as also Aleksandar mentioned, uses Chinese Chinese material, Chinese capital, but also Chinese workers are present, and based not on our research, but research done by Imogen Liu, who was in Belgrade, found that around 200 to 300 Chinese workers are based on these sites next to the constructions. In case of the Hungarian section, the loan agreements are already signed, and it's not yet clear how the construction will be carried out. But for sure, through this construction, what we found, other cooperation started to develop between the Hungarian and the Serbian, the Hungarian and the Chinese state, and also the Futan story relates to this because it concerns a site which is next to or very close to the Hungarian or the Budapest part of the Budapest station of this line, and also a logistics center hub popped up near to the line, which a share bought by Costco was bought up by Costco in the recent years, and the new loan agreements were signed by the state-owned policy bank of China, ICBC, and the Hungarian Minister of Finance. So what we could see that the spillover effect of these projects is really large, and there are direct sectoral linkages between this and other Chinese investments. So it's just a kind of trend which we can see growing, and even though the amount and the volume of investments is not that large, clearly it's a kind of start of something of more investment coming to the country and favoring the actual ruling political elite. I think, yeah, as also Lela is mentioning, we have quite little time, so I give the floor to Tamás.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll just speak on and continue of both of yours conversation, Aleksandar and Linda, using a bit of my data here. Let me just quickly share and continue. Please let me know if it's working. So maybe what I would continue with is that, again, how like a bit of a methodological remarks, and both of you have mentioned this. It's interesting to, I think, distinguish types of funds and investments, whether it's coming from a state fund and initiated in a buy, try, or multilateral agreements, mostly between states or state leaders, targeting typically infrastructural projects. That goes back to this type of a Chinese crisis management mechanism, which was very much infrastructurally driven, building, from bridges to hospitals, roads, ports, all kinds of things. And that is very much related to what Aleksandar so nicely explained as a kind of an overcapacity problem. So China is actually exporting capacity, whether it's labor capacity, capital capacity, or any other physical capacity. It's exporting it. It has to export it. It's a push factor more than a pull factor. But there are pull factors as well. So it's building a global network of logistical networks, or it's both building and purchasing. If you might be aware that actually China is a large buyer of European infrastructure in ports, for example, very much. It's one interesting story that links to the Budapest Belgrade case study is that it's related to the privatization of Piraeus, the Greek port, which Greece had to sell off because of the austerity measures back then in the EU crisis. Again, as Aleksandar mentioned, it was very severe, and it's no doubt Greece was probably the biggest victim of the crisis. So under the Troika's pressure, they had to sell their Piraeus port, and the purchaser, 80-something% of the buyer, was COSCO, China's overseas logistics company. And they will link it to the rail lines and the sea lines, so both the kind of Silk Road, the maritime Silk Road, as well as the land Silk Road. But Piraeus is not a unique example. Other ports are obviously in different conditions, are purchased by Chinese investors. So it's part of these large logistical networks that China is building, both because it has to export overcapacity, or it has to export capacity, as well as it has its all kinds of infrastructural needs and resource needs. It's building railways throughout Africa because, of course, it's connecting Chinese-owned mines, and it has to make sure that the delivery of all those materials. Again, Aleksandar gave us some very shocking statistics that comes to China. This is not self-evident. Well, from where all the cobalt is going to go to Chinese produced batteries, for example. So one thing, and I'll come back to this question a little shortly, that there is this overcapacity problem. It's related to infrastructural projects. It's very deeply tied to geopolitics, and we see these push and pull factors of what China is doing here and why China is doing here. But there are other types of investments, and again, and both Linda and Aleksandar mentioned these value chains, and you have large Chinese companies like Huawei or Wanhua, like in the chemical industries, that they have different purposes of internationalization, different types of push and pull factors. One of the factors for sure, what Aleksandar mentioned, like upgrading on value chain lines. They are like tip of the iceberg. So you have a lot of Chinese suppliers in various manufacturing industries. In fact, I know a little bit more about car industry. There you have a absolutely growing number of supplier firms, either based in China or already internationalized, that are actually moving up to the top of the value chain. But you have other industries like Huawei, of course, in telecommunications is very important. And their motivation, again, varies, but they want to get access to technology, that's for sure. And they want to get access to markets. And neither Eastern Europe or let alone Africa is not a super important market for them. They want to get access to large, rich Western markets in particular. What makes some of the Eastern European countries, member state countries, interesting for Chinese in this respect, that it's true that can be an entry point, that can be a point of departure or a type of reference for investing in these countries, through which they access EU markets. And this is a point where the kind of Hungarian elites' desire really matches neatly with the wishes of some of the Chinese investors. I might jump to this last slide of mine. This shows you which companies in which industries are actually active in Hungary, and you can make this distinction between these infrastructural projects, part of the Belt and Road Initiative, such as the rail line Linda mentioned, from various quite big FDI investments in export industries that are relevant in exporting value chain supplier companies, or even brand owner companies such as Huawei and Wanhua in the case of Hungary. The other thing I wanted to mention here, when we make this distinction pretty much between, let's say, FDI, private companies to some extent, vis-a-vis, BRI, which is more like multilateral interstate loan agreements. That's a quite different type of geopolitics and quite different types of funding technically speaking, the different types of fundings are, with different purposes. You have in this global, in the Chinese global presence, you'll have these different types. So you'll have more these companies targeting markets and technologies trying to enter to the EU, into the US in particular. You'll find less of them in let's say poorer African countries. You might still find like communication investments in some of the countries who are like badly in need of infrastructural projects, and they just don't get it from anywhere else. But they're not the most typical Chinese investments there. It's more the BRI investments are more there. Again, it's just to put Eastern Europe on the map, it's a kind of an interesting mix. You have both types, infrastructure and these logistics networks, but also large companies entering. Let me go back to the first slide, and here what we see, and maybe this is my second point from the point of view. This is just a snapshot of FDI. So you see China, the share of China is not extremely large actually compared to other FDI sources. In most countries, it's German FDI, and we know these industries, car industry, electronic industries are super important to mention here. And of course, we see even US FDI is in most cases, or in many of the cases, at least as big as Chinese or even bigger. So it's not necessarily super big in terms of financial accounts, if you like, or the balance of account dynamics, as I think Linda mentioned, but it's very important for various other reasons, geopolitics, or as Linda mentioned, spillover linkages that's coming out of this, as well as, I would argue, like sociologically speaking. So what's happening here sociologically, for example, it's the case of Hungary, that, local companies themselves would try to, upgrade or internationalize, or just simply, enhance their world market positions, oftentimes with collaborations with Chinese investments. Maybe it doesn't apply to the FDI, more to the BRI, but we know, and maybe Linda will talk a little bit more about that in the Budapest-Belgrade consortium, there is a closure in the contract that up to 50% of the construction, local firms are allowed to engage themselves in, which is actually quite unique in the Chinese BRI schemes. It again shows these geopolitical peculiarities. It will be a question whether that's going to be filled up or not, because unlike China, looking at domestic capital in Eastern European countries is more undercapacitated than overcapacitated. So you have to find or create those firms. And in Hungary, we know that the local political elite is very, engaged in creating its own business allies and creating companies and oligarchs, if you like, that are very much politically tied to them and dependent on them, and they want to push them into these consortiums to, get access to capital, get access to market, not just be like a crony ally, but this is a creating capital in an Eastern European context. So in the case of Hungary, the companies we know that want to or will enter into these consortiums are exactly those companies that's been created almost out of nothing by state subsidies and state politics. Maybe it's a bit of over exaggeration. I hope Linda will correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a very important sociological thing for local capital and for local state formations, that they use this money and use these projects for their capitalist endeavor. Let me put it that way. And you will not see just in between the lines of financial accounts. The other thing I wanted to add to this, I may just jump to my slides. I don't know how helpful these illustrations are. Again, the types of funding, this is a bit of a regional breakdown to put like some countries are EU member states, some countries are not EU member states. So they have different context in terms of geopolitics, in terms of tapping funds. And you'll see exactly how it breaks down to their type of usage of various types of loans and transfers, how much they are dependent and reliant on EU transfers or more on Chinese loans. So it's a bit of nuances amongst them. But what I was also going to say here in this upgrading, I think Aleksandar mentioned, is that, you know, it's not only contestations, it's not only competitions, let's say, between large companies like German car makers and their Chinese suppliers or Chinese brand owners. We haven't really seen too many Chinese brand owner cars in the EU market, but actually I anticipate they might come in someday. But there are a lot of complementarities as well. So you have very dynamic changes, technological market changes, changes of governance in these companies, and Chinese players, suppliers are ever more important. They're purchasing a lot of branches and other suppliers. We had the case in Hungary when one of the largest German car suppliers, Bosch, sold its one of its local affiliates to a Chinese buyers. That there's a restructuring within the value chains, and this is a very complicated thing. We might not know all the insights into this. This is very like corporate governance and corporate transactions, if you like. But we see that I would conclude something like, you know, there is a complicity and complementarity between European capital and Chinese capital as well. And they are on agreement in a lot of things. If you can recall, they just signed, the European Parliament signed or ratified the European Parliament did not approve the European Council's initiative of a European Chinese investment scheme. I'm not sure if I correctly call its name, that they would actually agree geopolitically how they're gonna initiate Chinese capital operating in the EU market, while there is European capital initiating in the Chinese market. So it was more cooperative than competitive, if you like. And this is a large framework. If you like, it's an EU framework accessing China and allowing China, within which, you know, Eastern European states would just kind of trying to gain some stakes in it. So my short conclusion here is it's not necessarily just an imperialistic competition as we understand it from a textbook, you know, US, China going to war, trade war, or EU, China going to trade war, but there are a lot of interlinkages at that level. Actually, it's a much bigger project of capital reconfiguration in this global multipolarization, if you like. And, you know, Eastern European states, for their political reasons, navigate within this context. And maybe one more sentence. I'll just keep on I think my slides are not necessarily super interesting. It's showing more the BRI investments in the region. It's very concentrated.
We have very, very little time left. So at this point, I will intervene and ask you to
I'll stop here. Okay.
You will stop here, or I mean, you can have this last two sentences to summarize.
Yeah, but I just wanted to have one sentence, which again, my colleagues hope will confirm or correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, to put it in this multipolarization concept, we'll see many interesting other actors, like Russia is funding part of the Budapest-Belgrade, the Chinese project entering into EU logistics. You will have Indian workers borrowed out, building the railways in Serbia, for instance. So it's not just singular actors, bilateral, you know, agreements, but when you really map it out in terms of its sociology, its infrastructure, its funding schemes, at least from Eastern European perspective, you will have a lot of these actors from Saudi Arabia, India, Turkey, Russia. China is really a tip of an iceberg. and then you have this EU context I mentioned, through which this whole restructuring is happening.
Thank you so much, Tamás. I'm very glad that you pointed out this very deep interconnectedness, which makes the whole bipolar portrayal of the story very useless in principle. We are running a bit out of time, but I wanted to come back to some of the questions that were asked throughout our discussion. First was actually about China and Chinese hegemony, and please correct me, but my feeling was that Tamás has responded to this in numerous ways and also illustrated the data on how big are the volumes of the investments coming from China versus EU and US. Yet I would give all of you very little time, about a couple of minutes, to reflect on our discussion altogether and take some of these questions that I will be voicing from the audience right now. So that would be one of the things to, again, reflect on whether China is becoming a hegemonic power. Another question was, and this was a clarification question, but very interesting one, to Aleksandar, to tell us what were the products that China was importing from Yugoslavia back in 70s. And then we had the last question about Eastern Europe and what is Eastern Europe and which countries are which countries are EU member states and which countries are non-EU member states. And I think if any one of you is up for taking this question, an interesting side of it, which partially was answered, but we can still emphasize it, would be the difference between actually EU member and non-member countries. And gladly here we have both cases represented. In terms of engaging with China and China engaging differentially with EU member and non-EU member countries. I mean, it was clearly, some of you have already emphasized that EU member states have different access to EU grants and loans compared to non-member countries, but it's also the differences in which fields China is investing in, for example, Visegrad countries versus Caucasus and Central Asia, or Belarus and Poland, or sorry, Belarus and Ukraine, or Serbia, Macedonia, etc. So these would be the three questions. You feel free to comment on one of these or some of these, and also offer your last comments to the overall discussion. Aleksandar, yes, please go first.
Okay, I'll try to be completely brief. I saw there was one question regarding the graphs I used. So 1 million workers are sent from China abroad to the whole world, while 2,500 and 5,000 were sent to Serbia alone. So that was the I mean, that's the difference I want to clarify for everyone. So that's one thing. Yugoslavia. So what was exported from Yugoslavia to China? It was mostly steel, mostly boat motors for some reason. Then industrial products, and Yugoslavia was importing textile, and later on it was exporting again. I mean, machine equipment, energy equipment, motor vehicles. I mean. How to say, mining equipment, mostly industrial stuff, basically leather, etc. So I mean that was the most exported things from 69 to 72. I'll finish with that. Regarding Eastern Europe, I replied in the comments, actually basically linked a Wikipedia article where you can read what Eastern Europe is and is not. But basically the main difference in terms of Chinese investments is that Hungary, as I know, but please correct me if I'm wrong, basically you need to have tenders or like a competition for different, I mean, companies. In Serbia you do not. So that's the main difference. So I mean, in Serbia you can basically do what's called a national project and just give money to a company. That's it. So you don't need to go competition and free market and all those things. You just give money to a company. And there's a good example of a company called China Road and Bridge Corporation, CRBC, which at the same time is beating like Austrian companies at Croatian competitions for bridges. So a company called Strabag was lost actually because it had too low prices in Croatia, but at the same time, the same company CRBC is inflating in prices in Serbia to build bridges in Novi Sad, the town where I come from and where I live. So it was interesting for me to see the same company using this difference, that to its advantage, to lower its costs in Croatia and pump its costs above all imaginable levels in Serbia, because it just got to be called the national project, which makes it unique. It doesn't have to obey market rules. So that's like the main difference. Again, I wanted to maybe emphasize that this is especially why the China threat narrative is not here. Doesn't capture all the dynamics. You see one company playing completely different rules, and that's why you need to follow the capital. Just to see what's going on, in both outside and inside the EU. That's why Eastern Europe is actually so interesting for researching. I won't be taking any more time. I wanted actually to ask, how much time do we have? Because it's very interesting.
I think we can, exactly. It's very hard to quit this panel. And I actually wanted to stretch the time a little bit, because you just received one more very interesting question directed towards you about racism that is voiced in Serbian media, and we've discussed this also a little bit in our preparation meetings. So if you can quickly address it, I think this is a very important issue to talk of.
Oh, yes. That's why I wanted to extend the time, because it's really, this needs to be answered. The answer from researchers, and it's good that we're actually here to discuss all of that. Because of all of these dynamics, China is investing in Serbia. Yes, it is, okay. But then, you have to go through politics, and who is, emphasizing and helping this investment? Of course, the ruling party and the ruling class. So what does the opposition in Serbia do? It starts anti-Chinese propaganda, and it goes wild with anti-Chinese propaganda. Last time we heard via Skype, as the panelists, 2 days basically ago, there was a huge, media, an article got shared 1,000 times through different media regarding a Chinese worker allegedly skinning alive a cat or a rabbit at the construction site at Linglong's factory. And this hits the news everywhere. Of course, people blame Chinese for being Chinese, basically. Of course, it was proven to be wrong. Last summer we had a similar event where just a Chinese person was pictured. He was photographed petting a dog, just like a Chinese man with a dog. And of course, what gets into the media is, Chinese are eating Serbian dogs. Jesus fucking Christ. It's below any rational level. And this got shared, 1,000 of times. It's really beginning to be too much. I, as a researcher, have huge problems because of this hysteria. Because as I mentioned, I went last year to several plants, Chinese plants in Serbia. Kostolac, Bor, Zijin. Now I went to Linglong. I cannot get all the data I need, because now these companies are afraid that I'm a journalist, that I will write basically bullshit about them. And this is counterproductive, because then instead of you as a person, as an audience, whatever, getting the true information via researchers, like me or someone else, then you don't get any real data. You just get these pumped up stories about Chinese persons eating dogs and cats. It's completely destroying any political dynamic. And I think there's also more sinister reason for it, and that's not only the Serbian opposition, but the fact that the Serbian opposition is mirroring what's being basically American anti-Chinese propaganda. Maybe you don't use this as researchers, but there was an institute called I will look it up, basically the Central Institute for Investment in Private Enterprise, CIPE, and basically they had this idiotic notion of corrosive capital. Center for International Private Enterprise. I'm sorry, I will basically copy paste it in the discussion. I mean, it developed the concept of corrosive capital to specifically, I mean, label Chinese and Russian capital, investments in Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the like. So basically, yeah, I won't go into that anymore. Okay, I'll just stop there. I spent the links. So, yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. And in the meantime, if Linda or Tamás want to pick up, we had one more question about racism, asking whether you think that the anti-China propaganda is related to racism. Linda, perhaps you would want to go next to take some of the questions or give us your concluding observations.
Yeah, having studied migration, it's a pity we don't have time to discuss a bit about Chinese migration in Eastern Europe. But what I maybe would point out now is like what I could see, which is pretty disturbing, that related to the story of the Futan campus and its development in the political narratives or in public debates. What I saw them most racist comments or let's say culturalized presentations of the issue instead of discussing it as an economic issue came from the left, and on the other hand, on the ruling government, since it's getting economic and political gains from the cooperation with Chinese, they could present themselves as more accepting and inclusive in this sense, which is yeah, pretty disturbing. And we can only think maybe just one thing about migration, how golden visa migrants and how the possibility of golden visa migration helped a large number of Chinese to invest in Hungarian real estate, and also a program which could favor a lot of members of the political elite, since the state bonds which had to be bought by the golden visa migrants went through an offshore company owned by circles close to the current, so close to the Orban government. So yeah, just maybe I stop here and Tamás can add some more things.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just maybe wrap up, and my way of understanding things. I hope some of you share my views. Starting saying that, yeah, it's interesting to distinguish, and these countries are in somewhat different situations, but from a global perspective, it's not that different actually, especially the geopolitics around it, and their kind of legacies of dependencies, economic and political dependencies coming from a long historical time. Aleksandar, of course, mentioned that if you're an EU member state, you have to comply with the EU competition law, but that's very much a written form and some kind of technical means in negotiating with capitals. So in the case of Hungary, we know there were a lot of behind the door agreements with EU agencies to actually give a green light to let's say large Russian investments in exchange for European companies being in the consortium. So again, if you have a sociological reading, then the interesting ways between the lines of those competition law regulations. So it was really not competition, it was geopolitics in a bit of a different genre. Yeah, so my take on the question of racism, which I think we all agree it is racism, but where to put it into our narrative, or how to kind of understand this. And it's true, we're a little bit getting lost in the analysis here in the very kind of political economy of the relationship between Eastern Europe and China in this global historical perspective. But what you get it from media, on the street, in private, discussions, that's never the kind of political economy of this, but there are these pre-established narratives already out there, which function some kind of some kind of an ideological field that's in a way nothing new, but it transforms with the social changes. And of course, what is peculiar in Hungary, maybe similar to Serbia, is that we have an election campaign period. And so these narratives going really big these times, and they really exacerbate a lot of the things that you did hear on streets always as some kind of racist attitudes, but not really entered the kind of political campaign as like established ideological contestations, and they are recreating these large political narratives of East and West. Are you going to the West or are you going to the East? Interestingly, one of the questions touched upon this. In Hungary, because of the local elite, that's a nationalist elite building national capital allied with China, you have a lot of these racist anti-China rhetoric from liberals contesting the sort of nationalist elite. So it's a really kind of a messed up thing if you just want to look at it as an ideology. But we know how ideologies work, and for me to conclude here is that we have to take them as ideologies. Okay, so we as analysts, whether we are on the side like Aleksandar is trying to negotiate with companies, or we're trying to understand what's really going on here, we question these narratives. We don't take them as face values. These are always false dilemmas. There's no such question of which capital is better, Chinese or German. No, that's not the choice we want to have. This is a massive economic capitalist historical restructuring on every level, and we have to understand our role in that, and we don't have to pick which capital we like more or less. This is not a valid question. That's what I learned from the analysis and from all of our experiences when we, it's even sometimes hard to ask these questions because you have to make these narratives subject to your question, and that's the point of departure.
Mm-hmm.
Tamás, gigantic thanks. I could not have gotten a better summary of our discussion that this is always a false dilemma. Please, Aleksandar.
Please. I want to underpin what Tamás said was very important, because we didn't touch upon the leftist issues. Serbia is full of people who are either like attacking me personally or someone else for being you're pro-China or you're either anti-China, and like some people are like, no, German capital is better, or China's capital is better. It's like, this is classic. Where are the workers' rights? Or like the left is completely swallowed up in this pro and anti-China. No critique of capital whatsoever. No, labor rights. What is that? It's like we need to bring the discussion back, and that's where I think this panel has done really a good job. I wanted also to maybe add a little, little detail, so as not to appear lost in the analysis of political economy. Basically, in one word, if I could say what characterizes China and US is that, and the Eastern Europe divides, it's like battle between different monopolies. So I forgot to mention that name, but I think that the European steel producers, for example, are monopolizing, just like I won't take too much time. Bundesverein Deutsche Industrie, like the German Association of Industry, has actually asked the European Commission if they could form super monopolies, like a European champion, as they call them, to defend Europe from China and Chinese companies. And you remember Siemens and Alstom, like the railway producers. They failed to monopolize, and now they're using China as an excuse to monopolize. So that's where the capital is battling against Chinese companies. And you have anti-steel duties, carbon taxes also being used for this purpose. The body called investment screening mechanism. So you see the EU is going institutionally against Chinese capital and protecting its own companies. So where does propaganda come from? Precisely that, America wouldn't invest, nor the EU would invest in so much anti-Chinese propaganda, if companies, it didn't need savings. So I just wanted to add that, because it's not that propaganda is just, you know, some evil persons just like writing evil stuff. It's like defending, you know, the European industry. So that's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
And always reinforcing a higher moral ground of Europe, right? We could, I think, really go on talking on these topics for a couple more hours. And indeed, I mean, I can see that even more questions are coming in, but I would feel urged to close up the panel at this point. I wanted to really very warmly thank the three of you, first of all, but also the organizers, and to remind the audiences that I hope some of these incoming questions can be addressed on the upcoming panels that TNI is organizing in coming weeks that really focus primarily on China. So yes, thanks a lot for sharing this slide. I think there was even one more, exactly, China and the world. Please have an eye and attend the upcoming seminars and discussions. Once more, very warm thanks, and you all have very nice evenings.
Thank you, you too, and thanks again for calling us.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Goodbye.